Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Jason. I'm the supervisor at the California State Railroad Museum. We are located in Old Sacramento, just about an hour and a half east of San Francisco. And we are currently closed. We are one of 280 state parks here in California. And this museum has been open since 1981. That's when we first opened our doors to the public. So what we're going to provide for you is a tour of the California State Railroad Museum. You'll be able to listen to a few of our staff members and volunteers. And right now the museum is closed, like I said. We normally see about 50,000 people in a year, but with COVID, it has been very quiet around here. A lot of us are working from home, and this is a treat for us. So I welcome all of you to seeing us here at the Railroad Museum, and I hope you enjoy our show. So before we get started, I want to introduce you to a couple of our team members. So Earl and John, if you wouldn't mind turning on your cameras. And Earl and John are here to answer your questions in the Q&A. So this tour is designed to be very interactive. If you have any questions, feel free to just write those into the chat. And we have a team of experts here to answer your questions. And then halfway through the tour, we're going to give you what we call Choose Your Own Adventure. And you'll have the opportunity to answer a poll and decide if you would like to learn more about the railroad post office car or the Sonoma steam engine. Both are here in the Railroad Museum. So without further ado, thank you guys. I will turn you over to Lauren DeTerra, who's our guide here, and she'll walk you through the process.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Jason. Sorry, I'm using a gimbal here. Let's make sure I'm in the right spot. Oh boy. Oh, here we go. Okay, sorry. Hi, everyone. So again, my name is Lauren, and I'm a park interpretive specialist here at the Railroad Museum. And I joined the team in September. So I came in when the museum was closed. So most of what I've been working on so far has been making digital education programs. So back in October, we filmed a few videos inside the museum. And the first 20 minutes of our program today, we're going to share with you 3 of those videos. And with the videos, apart from seeing the park staff, we have some historic maps and images thrown in there. And it takes us through the planning and building of the nation's first transcontinental railroad. So completed in 1869, the Central Pacific Railroad started from right here in Sacramento, built into the east. And we say at the museum that our lives are made of railroad stories, and we tell the story of the railroad through the stories of people. And the first person that you are going to learn about in our program is a man named Theodore Judah, who had the master plan for the Transcontinental Railroad. So we're going to journey back to the year 1854 and hop into our first station and learn more about him. And then in between these videos, I'll walk you through the museum and show you some of the exhibits we have. So I'll see you guys soon.
Have you ever had a dream? Or have you ever wanted to do something so badly no one was going to stop you from doing so? Well, that's how Theodore Judah felt about building the Transcontinental Railroad. He was going to build it, and no one was going to stop him from doing so. But why was building the Transcontinental Railroad important? Well, for one thing, California had just had a gold rush, and people from all over were trying to make their way to California to find their fortune. But at the time, there were only about 3 ways to get to California. The first way was to walk or ride a horse across the entire country. This could take anywhere from 6 to 8 months and was very dangerous. Many people did not survive the trip west. Another way you could get to California was by boarding a boat in New York, sailing down around the bottom of South America and back up to California. This way of traveling also took about 6 months. The final way you could get to California was by boarding a boat in New York, sailing down to Panama, walking through Panama through the jungle, boarding another boat and sailing back up to California. This way only took about 3 months, but many people did not survive this trip, as people often caught diseases such as malaria and yellow fever in the crossing of Panama. This allowed for Judah's dream to exist because a transcontinental railroad would allow people to cross the country in days rather than months. From the time Judah was a little kid, he loved railroads. In fact, by the time he was just 14 years old, he was helping to run a railroad in New York. When he was around 28, he got a job offer in California to help build a railroad from Sacramento to Folsom. He quickly accepted this job offer, and he and his wife Anna moved out to California. And although this job didn't last long, he saw it as his opportunity to start building the Transcontinental Railroad. Once in California, Judah started to do a survey of his desired route through the Sierra Nevada mountains. He would often take his wife Anna with him on these surveying trips. She would help keep him organized and even help sketch the surveyed land. Eventually, after about a year of surveying, Judah found a route through the mountains at a place called Dutch Flat. Armed with this knowledge, Judah went back to the East Coast to Washington, D.C. to try and convince Congress of the need to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Unfortunately, he was unsuccessful in this attempt as there were many different opinions on where the route should be. Once he returned to California, Judah looked for investors elsewhere. He first went to San Francisco, but was again turned away as their interest often lied in shipping rather than trains. He eventually found 4 investors in California. Their names were Leland Stanford, Charles Crocker, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins, who would later be known as the Big Four or the Associates. They helped Judah fund the final bit of his survey as well as make a map of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Armed with the map and knowledge of the route, Anna and Judah went back to Washington, D.C. once again to try and convince Congress again of the need of the Transcontinental Railroad. This time, they were successful, and in July of 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed it into law. Lincoln saw the Transcontinental Railroad as a way to unify the nation during the Civil War. Judah went back to California, and on January 1st, 1863, they started building the Transcontinental Railroad right here in Sacramento. Eventually, Judah and the Big Four had some disagreements, and the pair split up. Judah, not wanting to give up on his dream, headed back to the East Coast to try and find new investors to help build the Transcontinental Railroad, but unfortunately, on his crossing of Panama, caught yellow fever and died shortly later in New York. Although Judah never got to see his dream completed, the Transcontinental Railroad changed the history of not only California, but the country forever.
All right. Hi, everyone. So when you first enter the museum, I'd like to share with you the Transcontinental Gallery of what you would see here. All right. So we have our survey scene showing the challenges of trying to find a route through the Sierra Nevada mountains. And we have an exhibit that shows a camp and some of the instruments of the day that they would use to try and survey through the mountains, including we've got a solar compass here. And going back to math class, protractors, drafting tools, And their challenge was to find that route that was flat enough for a locomotive to go up. And here we have in our Transcontinental Gallery, the Governor Stanford locomotive. And it was built in Philadelphia in 1862. Then they had to take it apart, put it in shipping containers, and ship it all the way down around the bottom of South America, where it arrived in San Francisco. It was sent up the Sacramento River and then reassembled here in Sacramento to be the first locomotive for the Central Pacific Railroad. And as you heard in the video, there were a few different options that you had if you were to try and journey from the East Coast to the West Coast before the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And one of those options was to sail around the bottom of South America. So we're going to send you a poll question that if you had to choose, imagining you were planning a trip from the East Coast to the West Coast before the railroad has been built, which route would you choose? Would you pick the horse and wagon crossing the country on foot? Would you sail to Panama, walk across the land, board another ship and sail up to San Francisco? Would you sail all the way down around the bottom of South America, all of these options taking almost 4 to 6 months? Or would you cancel the trip because you don't have that much time and it was quite a dangerous journey? So go ahead and put in your answers, push submit. How would you choose to cross the country? And then Rachel, whenever you think everybody has submitted their answers, let's show me what they said. Okay, horse and wagon, Oregon Trail style got the most here, 5 of you. 4 of you making that long journey like the Governor Stanford all the way down around the bottom of South America. And then, yeah, 3 of you canceling the trip, maybe waiting for the railroad and staying put. All right, thank you, Rachel. So the next part of our tour, we're gonna move on to learn about the workers, the Chinese immigrant workers who helped the Central Pacific Railroad blast their way through the granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains.
Building a railroad is tough, hard work, and the Central Pacific had the difficult task of building a railroad up and over the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Chinese immigrants made up 90% of the workforce. They graded roads, bored tunnel through solid rock, laid track, and built bridges. They had to cut down trees and clear dense brush. They cut away land in some places and filled it in other places. And they did it all by hand because there were no steam shovels, power drills, or tunneling machines. Instead, they used picks and shovels, wheelbarrows, carts, and horses. The men worked 10 hours per day, 6 days per week. Work in the Sierra was the toughest of all because of how brutal the Sierra winters were. The winter of 1866-1867 brought more than 40 snowstorms. 40. The snow was so deep, the men working up there built snow tunnels to get around in, but they kept working. The railroad ran 24-hour shifts with Chinese workers chipping and blasting away at the solid granite rock. The railroad hired more than 10,000 Chinese men to do this work. Have you ever tried to break a rock? If you have, you know it's a really difficult thing to do. Well, imagine chipping away at a mountain built of rock and building a tunnel big enough for a train to get through. From 1865 to 1867, Chinese railroad workers built 15 tunnels. The most difficult was tunnel number 6, or Summit Tunnel. This tunnel was 1,695 feet long. That's almost 5 football fields lined up end to end. The Chinese worked day and night. Using a star drill, something similar to this, one man would hold it in place while another pounded it with a big, heavy hammer. And when he hit it with the hammer, the other man would turn it a quarter turn. Hammer, turn, hammer, turn, hammer, turn, all day until they made a hole that was about 2.5 feet deep. When they had several of these holes, they put in black blasting powder, and then they packed it with straw and mud and lit a fuse. Boom! It blasted away the rock, and the workers would carry away the rocks in baskets and wheelbarrows. Day after day after day after day they did this. Now, what do you think it would be like to work in a tunnel like that? It'd be cold, it would be dark, and very loud as you blasted deeper and deeper into the mountain. Your supervisor would be yelling at you to work harder, and the air would be so dusty and confined that it would be very hard to breathe. It was very difficult work. Many of the men died in blasting accidents or in avalanches in the mountains, but the Chinese continued to work hard, and they finished the tunnels in the summer of 1868. By the way, the snow was so bad the Central Pacific built 37 miles of snow sheds, like the one that we have here in the museum. Some people called that the longest barn in the world. Well, for all this work, the railroad paid Chinese workers less than white workers. By June of 1867, the Chinese earned about $35 a month, which equals out to about $600 in today's dollars. White workers made more, plus the railroad paid for their food and lodging. Chinese workers wanted $40 a month and to work 8 hours a day instead of 10. When the railroad refused, 5,000 workers went on strike. It was the largest strike of its time. This was very bad timing for the Central Pacific because they had a very strict time schedule to meet. Time was money, and the more tracks they built, the more money they made. Still, they refused to pay the Chinese what they asked for, and they cut off their food supply. After a week without food, the Chinese went back to work without the raise in pay that they had demanded. But they made their point. They stood up for themselves, and it was a sign of their collective strength. The Chinese proved to be very hardworking and dependable. They had to deal with extreme prejudice from other white workers and from supervisors. But they eventually earned the respect of Stanford, Huntington, Crocker, and Hopkins, the Big Four, who could not have built the railroad without them.
All right, hi everybody. So here we are back in the museum, and we have our snow tunnel, snow shed that Debbie was talking about, protecting the tracks from all of the snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And the display leads back and connects to that Summit Tunnel that she was talking about, the longest tunnel built through the Sierra Nevada mountains. And we are right next to Donner Lake. So put your hand up if you have been to Donner Lake before or driven by Donner Lake. Let's see. Can't tell if anyone's put their hand up. Let's see. Well, if you were to go to Donner Lake, you would be able to look across and see where that Summit Tunnel was built. Although it's not operational, you can still see where it is. And in our display here, you can see what Debbie was describing of the Chinese workers lifting the black powder up onto the cliffs, where they used the star drill. And we have a star drill right here. Ooh. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, everybody. Ooh, there we go. All right, we have our star drill that was used to make the holes in the granite 2.5 feet deep, about 2.25 inches in diameter, that they would pack with that black powder and clay. And in the end, there were about 10,000 Chinese railroad workers that contributed to the Central Pacific Railroad, getting them through the about 70 miles of Sierra Nevada mountains. And as we move forward to the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, where we met up with the Union Pacific in Promontory, Utah, we can't forget that the project would not have succeeded without the hard work of Chinese and Irish immigrants on the Union and the Central Pacific sides to build the railroad. So we're going to skip on ahead to May 10th, 1869.
The date is May 10th, 1869. The place is Promontory Summit, Utah. The occasion is the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The attendees include Leland Stanford of Central Pacific, Thomas Durant of Union Pacific, some other railroad officials, and about 1,000 track workers. All these people have come together at this location on this day to celebrate the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. This was the culmination of a 20-year American dream, linking California to the eastern states with 1,776 miles of track. The ceremony was supposed to take place 2 days earlier, on May 8th, but two important people were delayed. Central Pacific's Leland Stanford was being carried by a locomotive called the Antelope, but a crash with a fallen tree damaged the Antelope, and Stanford had to wait for a locomotive called the Jupiter to complete his journey. Union Pacific's Thomas Durant was delayed by angry track workers who had not been paid. The workers prevented Durant from departing for Promontory until they got their money. So the ceremony was delayed until May 10th. For this very, very special occasion, 4 very special railroad spikes were created. Nevada contributed a spike made of silver. Arizona donated an iron spike plated with silver and gold. A San Francisco newspaper gave an iron spike that was beautifully engraved and gold-plated. And Sacramento businessman David Hughes provided a solid gold spike. Most of the nation's telegraph wires were networked together so that as the final golden spike was tapped into place, the message could be received all across the nation. This allowed people everywhere to celebrate at the same time as the people who were attending the ceremony. As the last spike was driven, a cry went up, "3 cheers for the United States of America! Huzzah! Huzzah! Huzzah!" With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, it became possible for travelers to reach California from the eastern states not in 4 or 5 or 6 months of difficult and dangerous travel, but in 7 days and 7 nights. Does this sound like an improvement to you? Of course it does. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attendance and your attention.
Okay, thank you. So now the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, and we had a big ceremony what we like to say at the Railroad Museum was in 1869, this was the first time that the East Coast and West Coast of the entire nation could celebrate a big monumental event. Here, nothing on that scale happened for about another 100 years. In 1969, there was another big celebration that the nation got to watch on television and celebrate. And if you haven't figured it out, that was the first man on the moon. So right here, we are in our, we're standing near the Thomas Hill painting. This painting is called The Last Spike. This was commissioned shortly after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So in 1869, Leland Stanford requested the famous painter Thomas Hill to paint this picture of the Gold Spike ceremony. There were a lot of individuals who were not present for the actual ceremony, but he requested to have a symbolic painting that had pretty much everyone involved in the painting. And then right in the center, front and center, is Governor Leland Stanford. So this exhibit is one of our most prized possessions here in the museum. And then if you pan down a little bit lower here, this is a three-dimensional picture of the lost spike, of the last spike. This is a tactile exhibit. If you're sight impaired, you can put your hand over the picture, and there's nodes here that will give you information on the individual that it's showcasing. So this is the only three-dimensional tactile exhibit that is located west of the Mississippi. So we just got this for our 150th anniversary in 2019 for the ceremony of the Gold Spike, the last completion of the Transcontinental Railroad.
All right. Let's see. All right, everybody. So we are now going to hear from two of our docent panelists as they show us in a little bit more detail some of the exhibits that we have. And first, we do have Earl that is going to walk us through the cab forward. But before we do that, I thought we would have John come on and explain so that he has a little bit of time to prepare for which of the exhibits he's going to talk about, since we do have two choices. So John, could you please turn your camera on and tell the group, or first of all, you could say hello and a little bit about yourself, and then the two options that we have for the Choose Your Own Adventure.
Certainly. Pardon me. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. My name is John Lanham. I am a docent at the California State Railroad Museum. I've been in that capacity approximately 7 years. One of my duties is station master, as you read on my hat, and we take people on tours in person when we can get back in there. We're looking forward to it. The two exhibits that you have to choose from are a locomotive named the Sonoma, which was a narrow gauge locomotive, and the other item is the railway post office car that was used to sort mail while it was in transit across the country. In this case, our car ran from Chicago to the Pacific Northwest. Those are the two items that you can, one of which you can select.
Okay, so go ahead and click on the one that you would like to have John show us in just a little bit here, the railway post office car or the Sonoma steam locomotive, and push submit. And then Rachel will see what the group would like to go see. Okay. All right, John, ready for the railway post office? We'll do that in just a little bit. I'm going to mute myself here when we have Earl come up and take us through the cab forward.
Hello, everyone. My name is Earl. I'm been a docent at the California State Railroad Museum for almost 10 years. During most of that time, I've been a tour guide. I spend most of my time there giving guided tours in person to people that frequent the museum. So this will be a real experience for us giving a video tour. It's probably the first time I've done one. But I hope we generate enough interest that you'll probably want to come back and see us in person because it's a fabulous museum. Lauren, if you would pan this cab forward, starting with the end of it here where you are now, and then just look, see if you can turn your camera the other way and look at the entire length of it. This is the largest piece of equipment in our museum. It's also one of the largest steam locomotives ever built in the world, including the tender, which is that section that she panned first down there on the end. This beast is about 125 feet long and weighs over 1 million pounds. This locomotive, or engine as we are commonly calling it, is so long that it would even have trouble going around curves on the railroad track. So to solve this problem, the locomotive has a flexible joint in the middle, so it can in fact bend when it travels around the curve. And Lauren's going to take the camera down and show you where that joint is in the middle, so the locomotive can actually bend in the middle and negotiate the curves in the mountains. Should be right just in front of that, just a little bit to the left of that, Lauren. A little more to the left. Probably can't see it. Let's try a little more to the right. In there, there's a joint in there anyway. It's very hard to see on a camera. But that's a flexible joint in the middle so it can bend when it goes around the curves. This is referred to as articulation. So this is what's known as an articulated locomotive. This articulation results in 2 sets of driving wheels. If she backs up a little, you can see 2 sets of driving wheels. One set of 8 driving wheels is in the front of the locomotive, and the other set of 8 wheels is back behind the joint in the second section. By the way, these are huge wheels if you can't tell because of the standing back this far, but those are 63 inches in diameter. So those wheels are over 5 feet tall. The early versions of these locomotives were actually invented back in 1874 by a Swiss mechanical engineer. His name was Anatoly Mallet. They used a compound steam design. That means they used, in addition to articulation, they had both high and low pressure cylinders. The high pressure steam was fed to the cylinders in the rear, powering the rear set of driving wheels. And then the exhaust from that cylinder was reused and fed to the low pressure cylinders, feeding the driving wheels in the front. The engines then became effectively known as mallets or mallets, or malleys, as the railroad officials call them, because of named after the original designer of the locomotive. But because of the number of technical problems with this design and the desire to extract more power from the high pressure steam, this design was eventually replaced with what we see here, where high pressure steam is used to power both sets of driving wheels. Although these later models were not true malleys, the name stuck, and these locomotives were still called malleys by railroad engineers and shop employees as long as they operated. We still have people coming into the museum today wanting to see the Malley. Something else that's unique about this locomotive is the location of the cab. These locomotives were used to pull heavy trains over the Sierra Nevada mountains. And And if you look at the location of the cab on this, you'll see it's on the front of the locomotive. The cab is the location where the crew hangs out to run the locomotive. You scan around and look at a couple of the other locomotives in the museum. Any other locomotive you'll see probably in the world, you'll see that the cab is located farther back in the engine, back behind the boiler. But in the cab forward design, which is what we were just looking at here, the cab is actually located right in the front. It's called a cab forward locomotive, and that's where it actually got its name. It actually, compared to a conventional engine, it actually runs backwards. So why was it built this way? Well, on a conventional locomotive, the smoke and exhaust gases are expelled up front, way up on the top of the locomotive. And this exhaust eventually drifts back along the sides of the locomotives and enters the cab, where the crew has to breathe it. So the crew can actually become asphyxiated as the train passes through a tunnel. Well, you saw earlier in our presentation today that on that steep route through the Sierra Nevada mountains, there's over 37 miles of snow sheds. There's also a fair amount of tunnels. In fact, there's over 40 miles of tunnels and snow sheds combined covering the tracks. So it was pretty impossible to keep the crew alive when they were traveling through there, because they would be asphyxiated by the smoke and fumes from the engines. So they decided to redesign the engine and put the locomotive cab in the front and have cleaner air to breathe. And that's how we got to know the cab forward. That's how the cab forward design came to be. If Lauren would be so inclined, we'd like to take a trip up inside the cab and show you what it looks like in there. She'll have to climb the stairs and go up inside the cab. Can we do that? As we climb the stairs here, you can see how high up above the ground the cab was. That shows you just how enormous this locomotive was, not just in terms of length, but also in terms of height. We go through the door up there. Take a quick minute and look out the front of the locomotive. You'll notice right away, because the crew is now up front, they have a much better view of the track ahead. So besides having cleaner air to breathe, this was another benefit to this design. Turning around behind us now, and you can see two seats where the crew would sit. Scan over there to the right side for our left, which is the right side. You can see the engineer's seat. The engineer was really the boss of the cab. Yes, it was an all-male crew in those days. But the engineer controlled the power and the speed. You can see here this big lever that's hanging down in the way. That's called the throttle. To give more power, the engineer would pull back on this lever, which would send more steam into the cylinders connected to the driving wheels. Lower down at waist height, you can see the brake controls. A little more to the right, you can see those handles there. Those control the brakes. Steam engines actually had two sets of brakes. One braked the entire train, and another set was just for the engine. The engineer also had a full set of gauges, which you can see up there, which showed him everything from speed to steam pressure, even air pressure in the brakes. Now we're going to move around over to the other side of the locomotive's left side, our right side. And you can see another seat here, and that's the fireman's seat. We go a little more to the right. That's where the fireman would sit. The fireman's job was to control the steam. This was done by constantly adjusting the fire, which heated the water in the boiler to make the steam. Now, in this particular engine, the maximum steam pressure was 250 pounds per square inch. So the fireman would try to keep the pressure somewhere between 200 and 250 pounds. Too little pressure, and the engineer would scream at him and complain that he needed more power, and too much pressure, it could actually cause the boiler to explode. So the fireman had a big job. The fireman also had a full set of gauges, as you can see there. And he also had controls. If you look way down here below the gauges, you can see there's a big lever there. That controls the amount of fuel feeding the fire. I'll explain a little bit more about the fuel in just a minute. But let's go back into the middle of the locomotive and look right between the fireman and the engineer's seat. And you can see a big hole there with looks like a fire burning inside. That's known as a firebox. That's where the fire would burn to create the heat needed to boil the water and make the steam to power the engine. Like the engine itself, the firebox is huge. It's about the size of a bedroom on a house. That firebox covers over 500 square feet. Now, most people, when they think of steam in a steam locomotive, they vision coal. And maybe some of you have seen old train movies where the firemen would be seen shoveling coal into the firebox. Well, on a cab forward locomotive, that wouldn't work because you'd have to shovel coal all the way around from the tender, which we know is located in the back of the locomotive. Then you'd have to shovel it all the way around the front of the locomotive and then finally shovel it there into the firebox. That would really be impossible. So instead of coal, cab forwards, we burned oil, ordinary thick bunker oil, which is piped under pressure from the tender all the way to the front of the engine where it's sprayed into the firebox and it immediately catches fire, producing an extremely hot flame. Let's see if we can look way down inside that firebox. I don't know if the camera can get down in there or not. You scan up just a little bit. It's a little dark, but if you could see it inside there, you'd see there's a large nozzle, a horizontal nozzle out of which the oil is sprayed before it bursts into flame. If you were to look in that hole when the engine was running, it would be like looking into a volcano. You definitely wouldn't have the door open when the train was running. So anyway, in terms of history, the cab forward was really the signature locomotive for the Southern Pacific Railroad. They were built by Baldwin Locomotive Works out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The Southern Pacific bought 256 of these locomotives between 1910 and 1944. Initially, they were used strictly on the Sierra Nevada route, which you heard about today, but eventually they used them throughout their entire system because they turned out to be such wonderful workhorses. The locomotive we visited today was the last one made. It was built in 1944 and it ran until 1956. Of those 256 units that were originally purchased, this is the only one remaining. So we're very proud to be able to show it and display it here in our museum. Thank you very much. I hope you learned enough about this locomotive that you'll want to come back and visit us in person and see it up front and in person. Lauren?
See, we are back. Sorry about that. We are having a little bit of technology issues, so we have abandoned the gimbal and we're continuing on. Thank you so much, Earl. And let's see, John, would you please turn on your video? And I am walking us over to check out the Railway Post Office.
Thank you. Well, this was the adventure that you all selected. I would point out right away quick for those of you who are back east that the car we're going to look at operated from Chicago to go to the Pacific Northwest. Its function was to sort mail while it was en route. And that accelerated the delivery process on the other end when it arrived at its destination. This particular car was built in 1950. It was built by the American Car and Foundry Company. It was in service until approximately 1967. Railway Post Office car service in general ended in 1977 here in the United States, mainly because of the advent of automated sorting equipment that took care of the separation and identification of cities automatically. They didn't need a crew to do it. This car is about 85 feet long, actually 85 feet and 5 inches. It weighs 126,000 pounds. It's really heavy. It can carry a load of 22,000 pounds of mail or boxes and crates. Now, the door we're going in now is the entrance to the baggage compartment, if you will. And this is where large things, maybe somebody ordered a refrigerator from Sears Roebuck. It would be carried in here separate from the regular US mail. The crew in this area would be working as we pass through the baggage. It looks like we've frozen for a moment. There we are. The crew in this area would be 10 to 12 men. They would work 12-hour shifts. Effectively, they'd get on the train in their originating destination and go approximately 500 miles on their shift. And then they would spend the night at the end of that portion of the trip. The next morning, they get on the train and come home. Now, Lauren, I'm going to ask you to walk forward to those pigeonholes, if you would, please, and scan that area. There are over 2,000 combinations possible in those pigeonholes. We can't really tell with these cameras. They're not quite detailed enough, but there's a little spinning four-sided label on the bottom of each of those pigeonholes. Then you can label them. So as you go down the route, yeah, good job. As you go down the route, you rotate those to indicate the next cities you're coming to. So you don't have to have boxes for every city on the route. You just adjust the labels as you go. Now, the crews who worked in here made extra money for being on the railroad cars. They actually received a 20% pay differential versus people who were on the street delivering to residences. So the reason for that extra pay is it's hazardous duty on a rocking, moving railroad car. They had to be very accurate in their sorting. In order to retain their position periodically, they'd be tested. And they had to be able to flip the mail, is a term they used, a 98% accuracy rate in order to maintain their position on the train. Now, Lauren, you did a good job for me there. You showed that counter. On our counter in the car, we hope you do come and see it in person. These are the stamps that were used and the cancellation marks that were used when this car went into service in the 1950s. We've created these samples so that people can see the historical element of what many young people may not know. It's a stamp. All right, so now we'll look back down the car. Lauren, I'm going to change a little bit from our pre-arranged plan. Could you step? I'm going to make people dizzy. I'm not going to do that. All right, if you'll take a look and see the sorting table, that's one of 5 sorting tables that would have been there. We only have one on display because the crowds coming through get kind of pinched in there. But those tables were movable, and those iron racks you see in the back with the big bags for each city were available as they sorted the mail and packages. That table could be moved and repositioned as needed. Many tables. I believe I mentioned there would be 10 to 12 guys working in there, so it could be kind of close. And a 12-hour shift seemed like a long time to me to be on your feet. As we go down into the car now a little deeper, Lauren's going to take us to one of the open baggage doors, which is actually how the car could receive mail on the fly. Now, Lauren, the door has been slid a little bit, so we can't swing up the hook, but we can show people that cinder shield. If you look through the cinder shield right there, you see there's a gantry outside there, and a mail bag would be hung on that gantry. There is a hook on the side of the car that the operator would hold up perpendicular to the ground, and at 35 miles an hour, you'd fly by and snag the bag. If you look to your left, Lauren, just a little bit for me, we can show them the bag that would have been on that gantry. Back up a little, you see it has kind of a wasp waist arrangement that allowed the hook to grab it right in the center. And then the mail staff would pull it in and throw the mail on the tables and start sorting it. Pardon me. I would add here, though, there's another problem, and that's delivering the mail, getting it off the car. There were 2 ways they did it. One way was to stop the train and hand it off to the station master, but it costs a little extra to start and stop trains a lot. So in small towns where there wasn't a volume of mail, they would throw the mail out that door that Lauren was just looking out at speeds up to 10 miles an hour. They just slow down a little bit and they'd throw that mail bag out and be very careful to get it free and far away from the car. Because if it went on the wheels, of course, the wheels would cut those bags open and the mail would be damaged. Now, for most of us, we don't see mail all that much being sorted. So this is the beginning of service that started in 1864, and it evolved to what you see now. This car in 1950 was state of the art. It had fans in the overhead for the crew, and it had special lighting for everyone all night long. They worked. If you look at the top of the screen right now, Lauren, if you'll hold real still, you can see the second, third, and fourth class bins. They would throw newspapers that came from the East Coast, and they'd throw them up in there, and then those little doors would slide up and down to drop the mail down into the bags. It's a little easier to show you city names and how the whole mechanism worked if we can have you join us at the museum sometime. We'd love to see you. We'd love to walk you through and show you more of this car. I should add that this car is being presented in its 1967 appearance. This is the way the car looked when it retired. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you so much, John. We're going to make our way out here and join back with Jason in the roundhouse. And we have about 5 minutes for some Q&A. So I haven't been able to see questions that have been in the chat, but we're going to come on back and have Jason join us. And then if there are any questions out there, we can have John and Earl answer a couple questions that have not been answered yet.
Yeah, right now we do not have any pending questions.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's see. A little better lit here. There we go. Okay. Yep. This is good. Yep.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So thank you for joining us on this virtual tour. We had an absolute great time showing you the museum. I just wanted to let you know we're hoping to open soon as it's safe to open. And we invite all of you to come in and visit if you ever have a chance to come in and see us at the California State Railroad Museum. Some of the things, before I let you go, some of the things that we have done while we were closed, we are working on improving the museum lobby. So if you've ever been here before, the lobby and the back of the museum, we've polished all of the concrete and kind of redid the flooring. So it's nice and shiny and clean looking. We've added a few new exhibits. If you have a chance, some things that you can see now is go to our website, californiarailroad.museums. And in our website, you can see some of our virtual tours that we have up. The month of March is Women's History Month, and we have an exhibit that we've had up for a while now called Crossing Lines. It's kind of hard to hear with the mask on, but it's called Crossing Lines, and you'll be able to scroll through and learn about some of the amazing women who have helped contribute to the Transcontinental Railroad, to making the railroad more comfortable, safer, and just a lot of ideas and innovations that made our state what it is today, our country what it is today. So I think that's all I have for you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.